Welcome to the second session of the Extension Explores Food Preservation Summer Series. If you have questions during the presentation today, please drop those in the chat. We will have time after the presentation to answer those. As a reminder, this session is being recorded and you will receive a recap newsletter with the recording. Our topic today is long-term food storage. We are so excited to have Dr. Carla Schwan here with us today as our guest speaker. Dr. Schwan is an assistant professor and food safety extension specialist in the Department of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Georgia. Dr. Schwan also serves as the director of the National Center for Home Food Preservation. Her responsibilities include research and extension programming in consumer food safety, food service, and home food preservation. So thank you, Dr. Schwan, for joining us today.
Thank you for the introduction, Laurel, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today, sharing some information on home food preservation and how that leads to long-term storage, not only for home food preservation, but also foods that are manufactured by the food industry. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Can you see my screen, the presenter view? All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit, and I'll share a little bit about long-term food storage, preserving for the future. So that's the title I gave for the talk today. But you're going to see there's information about several different things that they come together and they complement each other, so we can understand how safely we can then preserve food and store it for when we need it in the future. So to start our conversation today, excuse me, I want to explore some of the concepts and bring some examples of why we humans like to store food. And I think when I think about food storage, the first thing that comes to my mind is emergency food storage, when you have an emergency, right? And that's one of the things that come to my mind. And so I don't know if that happens to you all too, but that's the first thing that comes to my mind. And very recently, we experienced life-changing events that brought a bigger emphasis to food storage. And so let's start looking into that. So as you probably remember, in 2020, we started to experience the impacts of COVID-19. So we're going to look a little bit on that and how that impacted our behavior and how we shift a little bit on that and how that finally impacted food storage. We also have seen the economic impact and how the rise in food prices also has affected that and consumer behavior at home. We all observed that there was demand for information, and it still is, as consumer behavior was changing and people were trying to adapt. And as a lot of people stayed home, they used social media to connect and other platforms to share information. And one of the topics, which is home food preservation and consequently food storage for emergencies, was very, very popular. So, but we all know that on the internet, sometimes you can find about anything, but it not always is correct, or the information is research-based. So, but the good news is that we have a lot of good information out there from different universities and government agencies. So I will share specifically today about food preservation, food storage, and some resources that you can access for later on if you have additional questions or you want to revise the material. There are some great things out there. And so looking a little bit on how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted our behavior and how everything impacted the food supply chain and the access to food and availability of food, and then consequently impacting food storage. So we've seen back then in March 11th of 2020, the World Health Organization then declared the COVID-19 as a pandemic and stated that it would not be only a public health crisis, but a crisis that would touch every sector. And so I wanted to remember this statement as we walk through the presentation today, especially when we talk about food prices, food availability, and which will then directly impact food storage. Then on March 14th of that same year, the CDC issued a no-sail order for all cruise ships and to cease activity in all waters that U.S. had jurisdiction over. Then on March 16, the World Health Organization, they released a strategic preparedness and response plan for that. And this plan covered what we have learned about the virus so far back then. And it also aimed to transform this information into a strategic action plan that could guide some national and also international partners on how we would attack this issue, we would tackle this issue. And so according to this plan, there were some priorities that were set and some actions that were outlined in these topics. And if I remember correctly, there were 8 of them, but for the sake of time and interest of the topic today, we're going to focus, and I want to call your attention for 3 of them, which is the surveillance and the quick response teams, the entry points, and then finally the prevention and control of infection. And then finally, between March of 2020 and November of 2021, the borders were closed to varying degrees around the entire world. And so you probably know where I'm going with this, right? And how we're still in some ways experiencing the effect of that. And so unlike some examples that we have, unlike foot-mouth disease or the bird flu or E. coli or Salmonella, Listeria, and COVID-19, we know that it does not affect directly the production, as it does not spread through livestock or agricultural products, but it still affects the food supply. But then how? And mainly because of the rapid spread that was happening among people and among workers. And so that's why governments were so concerned around the world and made significant restrictions on closing borders and slowing down production and processing of various food items. And so we observe significant restrictions in transportation of goods, of different foods, not only in the US, but throughout the world. So anything that was transported through land, water, and air as well was restricted, and at some degree still is. And so just to give you an idea, back then, the trucks for food distribution declined 60% on average when the restrictions started between 2020 and 2022. It really impacts our ability to access food and consequently have that food for long storage, right? So in developing and underdeveloped countries, temporary or seasonal employment is very common, and especially for planting, sorting, harvesting, processing, and sometimes transporting crops to markets. And in some regions in the US, this is also true. So as a consequence, the labor shortage that we had caused severe disruptions in the production of livestock, horticulture, planting, harvesting, processing, and all those steps that I'm mentioning, they are relatively labor intensive. We need people to do that. There was also a shortage of workforce as a result of the illness that was acquired back then, and physical distancing also that was mandated by government, so during production, so we couldn't have as many people working to producing our food. And so the biggest issues in the food supply chain were then obtaining the raw material that we so needed to produce several different items, and ensuring that there was a continuous flow for manufacturers to the end user. So these conditions all together, they really retarded the delivery of food and agricultural commodities, and ultimately created problems in providing a continuous food supply to markets. And I think all of us observe that. And so to continue to build on this production, we know the production was reduced, was suspended, or temporarily discontinued in many plants due to COVID-19 positive workers. And those were just, the people were also scared to go to work and getting sick in those plants, for example. And just to exemplify this scenario, the production capacity of pork facilities in the US decreased by approximately 25% in April of 2020. And so in addition to that, the close down of food plants then created this ripple effect in the food supply chain. And we know that when there is a great consumer demand for food products, we have empty shelves. And that, when we know that there's a decrease in supply, there is an increase in food prices. So we all experience how much more we were paying for food and still are. So now let's take a peek on how the food was affected in a global trade scenario, because some countries, they changed their food trade policies, restrictions exporting and importing into neighboring countries. And so they did that as an effort to protect their own country, domestic and in their domestic market, and securing, ensuring that food security piece was there for their own countries. So when that happens, when we have those restrictions in place, it is that the export restrictions, they really undermine the exporter reputation, and they reduce the confidence of the importer in the world market. So reducing the trust between trade partners, which then ultimately also impact the food supply chain. You have a disruption in the food supply chain. We know that a lot of the foods that we consume, we have them available all year long because we are able to import them from different countries. So all the impact that we've seen and all the factors that I described until now affected how the food prices were varying. And so I wanted to call your attention on this figure that shows the food inflation between 2012 and August of 2022, when this data became available. And so on the y-axis, we have the year. On the x-axis, on the x-axis, we have the year, and on the y-axis, we have the percent increase or decrease for particular food products. So as you can see, until about from 2012 to 2019, the prices were relatively stable, except if you look here in 2014. And I don't know if you all remember what happened in 2014, but in 2014, we had the Ebola crisis, where again, our food supply chain was affected by it. So it also reflected an increase in food prices. And so from 2020 to 2022, we can see a drastic increase in food prices, a food inflation of 11.4%. And that wasn't the data that was available, but it was until August of 2022, so which happened last year. So what is the prediction for 2023? And I thought it would be good to see that before we look into food storage. And so we know that food prices are expected to grow more slowly this year, and I think we are halfway through the year, but still we have some increase in inflation. And so it still is going to be above historical average rates because we're still experiencing that effect. So this year, all food prices are predicted to increase about 7.1%. And if you remember, last year was 11.4%, so a little bit less, but still compared to the overall average, which was about 4-5%, it's still more. Food at home prices are predicted to increase 8%. And what I mean by food at home is includes any grocery store or supermarket purchase that people prepare food at home. And then food away from home, the prices are predicted to increase by 8.2%. And those food away from home include purchases from restaurants and retailers. So in addition to that, now let's take a look at consumer behavior. Due to the restrictions, and consumer could not go to restaurants, and they were preparing most of their meals at home in 2022. So another fact is that consumers did not want to go to the markets or supermarkets due to the fear of catching COVID-19 at the store. And then due to the reduced availability of certain types of foods, we observed panic buying behavior and elevation of food prices because of the high demand that we had, and we didn't have a continuous food supply being shared. So I don't know if y'all remember, this is not a food example, but it's really vivid in my mind. The toilet paper shortage that everybody was buying. So that is an example of a panic buying behavior that we observed back then. And so people were afraid they wouldn't have enough food, the same way that with the toilet paper, people were buying food and trying to store food as much as they could. And that really contributes to how we perceive nowadays emergencies and how we store foods for emergencies and situations like that. I think it's very vivid still from 2020 onwards. So the demand for frozen vegetables increased by 52% in that week that the pandemic was announced. And in addition, there was a study that was conducted, and I believe there were 18 countries that participated in this study. And they revealed that food buying behavior changed, increasing consumers' preferences for healthier foods because they were attempting to improve their immune system due to the virus. And so, but the same consumers were also worried about exceeding their budgets because food was so, the inflation was so high that it was so much more expensive. There was also a healthy food consumption increase by 33% for vegetables, 29% for fruits, and 26.5% for legumes. And on that note, consumers experience the reduced availability of those certain foods, especially things that you can grow in your backyard or in your garden. And so we have seen that homegrown gardens increased by 34% in the United States. And one of the reasons are the availability and access to food. And then since 2019, there was an increase of 620% in website access and 270% in requests for home food preservation validated recipes. And so due to all these factors, we have observed a high demand for information in preserving foods at home and storing foods for long periods of time in order to try to prevent or be prepared for an emergency when that happens. So now that we have set the stage about some of the behaviors, some of the changes that we have seen in the last few years, I want to explore some aspects that we need to consider when we are storing food. And so there are two main core concepts that we talk about when we want to talk about food storage. And so the first one is food safety, and the second one is food quality. And they are two different concepts, but they go along hand in hand. So when we talk about food safety, we are talking about practices and conditions to protect the food supply from microbial, chemical, allergenic, and physical hazards that might occur during all stages of production and handling as well. When we are talking about food quality, on the other hand, we are talking about considering features and characteristics of the food product that is acceptable to the consumer and conforms the required specifications by the agencies that regulate that product. So food safety, as I already mentioned, food safety and quality, they really complement each other and they go hand in hand. I could make food safe all day long, but the next question is that would be people able to eat it? Would it taste good? So they really complement each other. And when we are talking about food storage, we need to talk about both. So food quality has several factors and specifications that make up this concept. It's a big concept. And as you see here in this figure, it is divided into internal specifications and external specifications. And both of those are really important concepts. But again, for the sake of time today, we're going to focus more on the effects of some of the external specifications that are extremely important in food storage. And so oxygen is a very important one. Oxygen catalyzes chemical reactions that leads to rancidity, so the quality specification of the product. And rancidity, oxidation will occur in fresh and frozen and dried food are some examples of where you can see that. And so we know that by removing oxygen, in most cases, it will extend the quality and the shelf life of food, which then, is one of the desired aspects that we want when we store foods for a longer period of times. The second concept that we are going to walk and talk about today is, in the next few slides, are biological, or I guess the food safety aspect, and it has several different components to it. But today we're going to focus on biological hazards and how those need to be controlled to extend the shelf life for storage as well. So quality and safety together. In order to extend shelf life of a food product, it is really important to control the microorganisms that are present in food. And so some microorganisms are present in food. They are there intentionally, like cheese and yogurt, and they are good. Some of them can cause spoilage to the food, so they are not as good, but some of them can be harmful. They can cause disease. And so in order for us to control their growth and survival, we need to understand some crucial factors that affect their ability to grow and survive in food. And so let's dive into this concept. And if you have seen this before, we often refer to this as fat tom, so it's easy to remember. So the food source and what are the nutrients available for those microorganisms. As humans, microorganisms also love different resources in food that they can find. For example, fat, carbohydrates, all the things that we love, they also love too. The second one is acidity. So we often measure that by measuring the pH, so how much acid is in the food. The next one is temperature. There is specific ranges of temperatures where organisms like to hang out. And then time, for how much time they are there, because we know that time is an direct effect of their multiplication and how big their population becomes. Oxygen. So it also will determine what organisms are going to be surviving in that environment and what are the ones that are going to be excluded in that environment. And finally, moisture. So we often measure that as water activity, not water content, but water activity. What is the water? What is the amount of water that is available in that food that is available for the organism to utilize and grow? So an example of this, so jams and jellies, they have high water content, but most of that water is bound to sugar, and so it's not available for the microorganism to consume and grow. And so jams and jellies are relatively very safe product because of that. We are able to control this factor right here. So again, food, which is the F of the fat tom, so nutrients, they provide the energy, vitamins, and minerals that organisms need for reproduction. And I should clarify here, when I say that organisms grow, I don't mean that they grow in size. I mean that they grow in number. So just to give you an example, about every 20 minutes, so E. coli, which can be, we have strains that are pathogenic. So let's say we're talking about strain that is pathogenic, every 20 minutes is going to double its population in numbers. So you do the math, it's relatively quickly for that population to be very big. So foods that really support the growth of microorganisms well are so moist, foods that are moist, foods that are high in protein, that are low in acid, also foods that contain fat. And then if they're not handled proper, or if they're handled improperly, any food then can be hazardous, right? So the next one is the pH and acidity. So as I already mentioned, the pH is one of the measures that we use to see how much acid there is in that particular food. And we know that different foods have different pHs. So the pH scale goes from 0 to 14, where 0 is very acidic. So we have the example here of a lemon that is 2.2 to 4.4, and then 14 is very alkali. So meats, vegetables, they will be in the range that is more alkali. And then 7 is the neutral, where we usually our water is around 6, 7. Time and temperature, super important concepts when we're talking about controlling microorganisms to extend the shelf life of food products. So time, as I already mentioned, the generation time or the doubling population time for E. coli is about 20 minutes. The temperature, so the temperature is super important, and we often talk about the temperature danger zone that varies from 40 to 140 for consumers' food safety, which is a little bit different from retail food safety, but for our presentation here today, we're going to talk about the consumer food safety range. So this is the range where bacteria multiply very rapidly, and we want to avoid keeping our foods in that range. And then oxygen requirements. There's 4 main categories that bacteria can survive and hang out. And it depends on their species and depends on how they are built to support certain environments. So the first one is aerobic. So organisms that love oxygen, and then anaerobic organisms that do not, they hate oxygen, they prefer to have an anaerobic environment where oxygen is not present. And then microaerophilic, that they can grow in atmospheres that have reduced oxygen, so modified atmospheres. And then facultative, there are microbes that they prefer one type of atmosphere, but they really can grow in multiple types. So E. coli, again, is one example. When E. coli is in the gut of warm animals, for example, cattle. Inside the gut of the animal, you have a anaerobic environment, and the bacteria is able to survive. When that E. coli is shed through feces from that animal, then the E. coli is then exposed to the oxygen, so just normal air, and so it's able to survive as well. So that's one example of facultative microorganism. Finally, moisture and water activity. So again, it's a measure of how much moisture is available, and this is very crucial, this word here, how much is available in that food. And then it's measured from 0 to 1, and foods, so water, distilled water would be 1, so it's pure water. Anything, so a food would be less than 1 because you have other components in that food that are binding to that water. So now that we have seen a little bit of what microbes require to survive and grow, we know that we need to control these factors in order to control them in food and therefore safely extend the shelf life of that food product, right? So today, we are going to look at 3 methods that we use to extend the shelf life for prolonged food storage, and some tips people can utilize when preserving foods at home and storing those foods for emergencies. And so today we're going to be covering canned, dried, and frozen foods. And later on, we're going to see manufactured foods as well. So now looking at canning, once you have done your canning at home and you are ready to store that food, and this is what we're going to be focusing on today, you want to make sure that you have your food is properly cool and the canned food after it is processed. So after it's cooled, you want to check for seals, make sure that the lid is on and you have a good seal after the processing has happened. You also want to remove the ring band around your jar and make sure there is no debris of food there, because those could be providing nutrients for microorganisms to grow. And so you could have mold there if you don't check that. And then maybe 6 months in, you're going to go to take that jar and you realize there is mold, and you don't know if it was because the process failed or because you just had some foods that were outside and you failed to clean that jar. So the next thing, you want to make sure that you label your jar with the day, maybe the canner batch, so you know for how long you have had that food. And store in a cool, dry, and dark place. For best quality, we recommend using them home canned food products within 1 year for best quality, but no more than 2 years. So there are some studies that we have seen, and the recommendation for safety-wise, no more than 2 years, but for peak quality, 1 year. And then before you open anything or you consume anything, examine all the canned goods to make sure they look good. There's no sign of spoilage or mold or any bubbling or any fermentation happening in that food product, which could then indicate it is not suitable for consumption. So now looking at drying, we know that drying removes moisture from the food. So bacteria, yeasts, and molds cannot multiply. And here really in this concept, what we're really talking about is water activity. So we are lowering that water activity, and that water is not available for organisms, so that we are able to then have that food for a longer time. So it also slows down the action of the enzymes that are present naturally in produce, but it does not inactivate them. So it slows them down, but they will still be there working. So again, we're going to see some timelines on for how long of a time we can keep certain foods for quality and safety. So we know that dried foods, they are susceptible to insect contamination and moisture reabsorption, which is not good. But if you do a good job of keeping them in an environment, in a container that is dry and away from sun and heat, then you should be okay. So we know also that color and nutrients will continue to be lost over storage time. So that's just known. And oxygen can promote faster color loss. So again, oxygen plays a really big role on how the quality of that product is affected. In addition to, in a little bit, we're going to see how oxygen plays a role in a very important bacteria that could cause botulism. So we recommend that food is packed in amounts that will be used in a recipe, because every time you open a package and reopen it and open it, that food is exposed to air and moisture, and that really lowers the quality of that food over time. So storing dried foods, so they must be properly packed and stored. So once you have dried that food, and there's several methods that you could dry that at home. It could be you have a dehydrated, maybe you're doing oven dry, maybe you're doing outside drying. Whatever the method you're using, after you're done drying that food, you need to make sure that it's cool completely, because the warm food that you have, if it's not cool completely and you put that in a bag, it is going to sweat, and that moisture is going to be condensated in the pack, and you could have bacteria growth inside it. So you want to pack it into a clean, dry, insect-proof container as tightly as possible without crushing it, of course. So you can use different containers, so glass, metals, or boxes with tight lids that will keep the moisture vapor out. So those are good options to keep your dried goods. So heavy duty plastic bags are also acceptable, but they are not insect or rodent proof. So also keep that in mind depending where you're storing that. And then something that is really important, if you did any pre-treatment with your fruit, let's say you want to stop that browning from happening, there's different treatments you can do. So if you have done sulfur, if you apply sulfur as a pre-treatment for that, that fruit should not be touching the metal, because that can cause a reaction with the container, and that sulfur fumes will react with the metal and can cause color change in your fruit. So if you do have a fruit that you have treated with sulfur, it's best to put that in a bag, a plastic bag, and then put that in the container to avoid that chemical reaction that can happen between the metal and the container and the sulfur. Also, copper is not recommended, because copper oxidizes and will destroy the vitamin C that is present in your fruit. So avoid those types of metals. Again, stored in cool, dry, and dark areas. And so recommended storage times for dried goods can range from 4 months to a year. And so keep in mind that food quality is affected by heat. So storage temperature will determine for how long of a time you can store that food. And so the general recommendation is that for most dried fruits, you can keep them for 1 year at 60 Fahrenheit, or 6 months, at 80 Fahrenheit. And then the vegetables have about half of that shelf life of fruits. So when foods are packed, once they're dried, we use this term, they're bone dry. They're super dry, so they can spoil if moisture is reabsorbed during storage. So always check foods that were dried frequently during storage to make sure that they're still dry. So if certain foods, once you are checking it, you see that they are affected by moisture, but they're not spoiled, and this is an important note, you can use them immediately, or you can dry them and then repackage them. So there is an additional effort of time and also resources if that happens. But if they're spoiled, then unfortunately you have to throw it away. So molds are a sign of spoilage that you can visually see and determine contamination. So I have been getting a lot of questions about utilizing modified atmosphere packaging, or MAP. That's how we often refer to it as well. And so this technology is really great, but it's so important to know that how to use it and when to use it, because otherwise it can create an environment for harmful bacteria to survive and produce toxins. So Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria that produces the toxin, that the disease is called botulism, is a concern in this case. So there are two main oxygen absorbers that we are going to talk about today. So the first one is the one that will reduce the oxygen levels in the food product, and the other one will reduce the oxygen levels, but it will increase the carbon dioxide levels in that product. So those are available for you to purchase Amazon and different places. So I've been getting a lot of consumer questions about this. So there are several concerns with this type of packaging. So let's break it down. So when we are reducing oxygen levels in a certain food product, without any intervention step, it's already a concern for Clostridium botulinum. So generally, dried foods have a low water activity and they will not support the growth of Clostridium botulinum under normal circumstances. So we didn't have to worry about that. However, if the process of the packaging process is not done correctly, or if the temperature of the store is too high, you run the risk of generating moisture condensation inside that package and increasing the water activity. So with that, when you have the moisture condensation, you increase that water activity, which could be affected by storage time and the density and the type of food. Now you have a perfect scenario that you remove the oxygen, because we know that Clostridium botulinum is an anaerobic organism, meaning that it grows well under no oxygen environment. Now you have moisture, so we know that water activity is now higher because of condensation, or depending on the type of food that you have, and ambient temperature, right? Because you are perceiving that product is shelf stable and you're not refrigerating it. So it's just a perfect combination of factors that will then enable Clostridium botulinum to produce toxin under these circumstances. So one example that I like to give about density and the type of food, when you have okra, so whole okra, and you're drying that and you're not drying it properly, it is such a dense and thick vegetable that it could look on the outside that is dried, but inside you could have pockets of moisture. And when you have that and you put them in a container where there is no oxygen, you remove the oxygen either by vacuum packaging it or by adding those oxygen absorbers, you could be creating a perfect condition for Clostridium botulinum and producing the toxin. So the second case is where you have an oxygen absorber. So it's going to reduce oxygen and it will increase the concentration of CO2. And so we still have a problem with this scenario, because it is not only inhibiting the levels of oxygen, but it's also increasing CO2. And there has been some research showing that by doing this, in fact, the growth of Clostridium botulinum could be stimulated by the increased level of CO2 in the product. So food companies are able to do this because they have specialized processes, they have interventions in place to avoid certain things. But when we do this at home, we need to be very, very careful on how we package our foods and what type of foods we are packaging for long storage to avoid any potential risk of botulism. Another frequent question that I get is about vacuum sealing dried foods and utilization of this mylar type pouches. They look something like this. And so when you have sealed properly dry foods, that they are safe because, with the absence of moisture, when the water activity is really, really low, we don't need to worry about Clostridium botulinum, right? And so it's perfectly fine to use this container. However, vacuum sealing moist or wet foods provides the optimal environment for the growth of botulism or Clostridium botulinum and consequently the toxin. So some people mistakenly see foods like this in the supermarket, like a tuna style pouch that is you can buy at the grocery store, and they assume that it's only vacuum sealed, and it is not. It is heat processed just as if it was in a can or in a mason jar. So you cannot simply take wet foods to utilize a mylar type pouch, seal it, and think that it will be okay, and think there will be shelf life just because you see that at the grocery store. That's not the case at all. So remember, vacuum sealing, it is only safe for dry foods that have lower water activity. So vacuum sealing moist foods might lead to botulism poisoning. And of course, we do not want that. So home canning and this type of pouches require special knowledge and equipment if you are doing something else other than dried vegetables or fruits, and properly dried, I should say. So we do not recommend using this practice if you don't have the right type of food, the knowledge, or the experience to do that, just to avoid the risk of botulism. So now let's move to our last preservation and storage method, and we are going to be talking about freezing. So when proper packaging package is used, it will protect the flavor, the color, the moisture content, and the nutritive value from the dry climate of the freezer. And so it is recommended that a half-gallon size or smaller is used for fruits and vegetables. And so good containers, when people want to know what type of characteristics they should look for in a container, what are good characteristics in a container. And so moisture vapor resistant characteristics, that the container is durable and is leak proof, and it does not become brittle, and it cracks at low temperatures, so it's resistant to oil, grease, or water, that it will really protect the food from absorbing off flavors or odors from other foods in your freezer. It's easy to seal, and it's also easy to mark, because guess what? 6 months from now, I mean, sometimes I don't remember next week what I just ate yesterday. So it's really important to mark and to have that labeling of that food product, so you know for how long it has been there. So some tips. So you want to freeze quickly. So freeze foods at 0 Fahrenheit or lower. And a good practice is to freeze very quickly, is to set the temperature of your freezer at -10 Fahrenheit or lower about 24 hours in advance when you are going to freeze that food. That would help with the quick freezing. And when we do that, we also avoid those crystals that are present, the water that is present in the tissues of vegetables, for example. When you freeze them super slow, they will puncture that cell wall of that produce, and water is going to leak. You're going to have a mushy, less quality product. It's not a safety problem, but it's a quality problem if you freeze them slower. So again, freeze foods as soon as they are packed and sealed. So you want to do that process quickly to ensure safety and quality of that product. You do not want to overload your freezer with unfrozen food. So you want to make sure that you leave little spaces between the packages so the air can circulate between them. And then once they are frozen, then you can better pack them close together. So you want to leave that room for air to circulate. So the storage times and recommendations that we have, they are for quality. Of course, if your freezer keeps frozen temperatures. So the temperature really matters for shelf life. And so if the food remains frozen, it remains safe. That's it. That's not really anything else to it. But keep in mind, when you have not only sanitation, as it says here, but also the quality and sanitation going in is the quality and sanitation coming out. There's no magic that's going to happen in that freezer just because you're freezing that product. So always keep that in mind. And I always like to ask this question: is the turkey in the freezer for 2 years safe? Anybody would like to take a stab at that? All right. So yes, it will be safe. But quality-wise, I don't know if you want to have it for 2 years in your freezer, but it will be safe if your freezer keeps frozen temperatures. Headspace is something really important when you are freezing as well. So it helps with preventing broken seals. So there's a table here that I put for you, and you're going to have access to this information later on as well. But depending on the type of product that you have, if it's liquid pack, dry pack, or juices, there's different headspace requirements that we recommend to ensure that your food is frozen correctly, and you're going to be avoiding any broken seals, because we know that when things freeze, water expands and they're going to become a little bit bigger than they were when you put them in. So now moving on to some of the products that are produced commercially, something that is really I want to talk about for long storage, that some concepts that are important to keep in mind in this case is that most commercially processed foods have a best if used by date shelf life marking in their products when you buy them at the store. So this is really the date that the manufacturer feels that retains the intended quality that they have for that product, and flavor, texture, so quality parameters in this case. So it's specifically true for canned and dried foods, since neither of those will support the microbial growth and will not have the water available, leading to spoilage or illness. And so their product shelf life is determined by quality and not safety. And so the true shelf life of any safe, dried, or canned emergency food storage item, it is the time frame that you're willing to use that product for how long you're willing to eat that product for. So we know that even poor quality foods that have been stored for a while, they will have nearly all the original contents of nutritional levels. It might taste bad because it has been there for a while, but it might save you in a life emergency situation that you have. So in contrast, the use by dates are usually food safety issues, and they should not be exceeded. So foods with a use by date, expiration dates, should not be used for food storage. So most people don't know this, are not aware, but expiration dates are not required by law, and expiration dates or use by dates are usually related to food safety issues. So there is a little oversight on this type of dates. So for food storage purposes, some manufacturers list their expiration dates as 10, 20, even 30 years on their products. And so those dates are rarely scientifically determined, and it's more of a marketing claim than anything else. So always look for those markings in the product when you buy. And then I didn't mention, but the sell by date is usually an indication for the store itself, or like when is the time that you should sell that product by. And so the use by date or expire dates, they list that, and then the deterioration that happens in that product quality, and also some spoilage could be happening as well. So we do not want to use those two categories for long storage, because by the time you're ready to consume that in an emergency, it might already expired, and it could be spoilage present as well. So another alternative of products for long storage are what we call MREs, so meals ready to eat. And they were released by the US government as a food source for the military around 1975. And so the MREs were designed as a self-contained individual ration in a lightweight packaging for the military. And so before this technology was available, they had canned foods that were really heavy to carry, or dry foods that require really rehydration. And we know in the military, you need to have something that is more easy to be consumed. It's not heavy, it's flexible, and there's just several advantages to use this technology. So initially, as I already mentioned, those MREs, the meals ready to eat, they were only produced for military by different contractors. And then due to the prevalence, and it's not surprising, but a little bit unique when I was reading about this, is that there was so many unauthorized sales of this type of foods to civilians, that the military began placing a notice on the packages that the release was not permitted to just normal people, so civilians. And because of the demand was so high, then they came up with two different MRAs today. So we have the military one, and then we have the civilian one for people that want to store food for emergencies. And so oftentimes the package looks very similar, but there are two different versions that regular people can buy, as opposed to what military has available for their own purposes. So when a disaster occurs, you probably have no refrigeration, electricity, gas, water, sewage treatment, or even phone services. And this means that you are on your own to care for food, water, and other emergency supplies. in sufficient quantity for at least 3 days. And I say 3 days because that's the average time that usually services are reestablished in the US. Depending where you are, if you're in a different country, that that will vary greatly. So it's important to stock canned foods, dry mixes, and other staples that do not require refrigeration, cooking, or water, or special preparation. So you have that on hand. It's easy access, and you don't need a lot of additional supplies to make it work. So examples that are good for long-term storage, like a 3-day storage example, is so ready-to-eat canned meats, fruits, vegetables, also a can opener if you have them. So protein or fruit bars, dry cereal, granola, peanut butter, dried fruits, nuts, and also don't forget, if you have infant or pets in your household, food for infants and also pet food as well. And so some drink examples that you can store and have available for your long storage purpose are bottled water, soda, juices. So you want to always have full sugar, not diet. And of course, depending if you are diabetic, that's a different story. But the purpose of this is that you have energy to keep going when you have an emergency, and you're going to have that high calorie intake for the days that you don't have as much food. Also, non-perishable pasteurized milk is an option. Those are really common in certain in developing or underdeveloped countries due to lack of refrigeration. Here in the US, you mostly see milk that is pasteurized but needs to be refrigerated. So you might be able to find some of those options at a grocery store as well. And then how much water should you store for an emergency? So for a 3-day emergency, or for like a day by day basis, it is estimated that 1 gallon of water per person per day is required. And so for an emergency, when you have an adult man, it is required at about 3.7 liters, which is approximately a gallon. And then for adult woman, 3/4 of a gallon, so 2.7 liters for that. And just as a recap, we want to choose foods that are low weight in case you need to travel somewhere or due to a storm or something. You don't want to have heavy items to carry. So you want to have items that are high calorie, minimal prep, that have long shelf life. They taste good, that they don't require refrigeration or cooking or additional water. And also is a good idea, use foods before the expiration dates and replace them with fresh supplies, and change them, the food and water supplies, between 6 and 12 months. So if you have a special dedicated long food storage item supplies that you keep, is a good idea just to keep checking on them. And if you see they're going close to their expiration date, if they have one, consume that and then replace them. So when you need it, you have those items available and they are good to go. So some research-based information that I want to share with you today. So universities and cooperative extension services provide really great research-based information, not only for home food preservation, but for food storage. So here we have the National Center for Home Food Preservation. We have recipes, we have storage tips, and preserving foods in different methods as well. So if you're interested, here's the QR code. And also Utah State University has a great guideline on long-term storage where they talk about different food items. It's a very long document, but really, really value document with different information on different items if you want to check it out. So here are some references, and I thank you for your time, and I hope I didn't go over time. So let's see. I think I talked super fast.
You did it. Thank you so much, Dr. Schwan, for the very informative presentation today. I know that a lot of our family and consumer sciences extension agents have been getting questions about long-term food storage because it has been a very popular topic. And so I think it was great information for us extension agents, and then also those from the general public that joined us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's really nice to connect with you all. Last year, when I moved to Georgia, one of the first places I went was to Tennessee, and I had an amazing time learning with the agents and with Dr. Bernie. So it's really a pleasure to be connected with you all again, even though it's through Zoom, but it's always nice to connect with you all.
Of
Thank you for the
course.
opportunity. And if
Yeah.
there are any questions, I'll be happy to.
Hilda, are there any questions in the chat?
At this time, we do not have any questions, so hopefully there will be some informal questions if anyone is out there wanting to just speak on the Zoom now. I think we have a few more minutes left.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, you can drop them in the chat or unmute. I will go ahead and take another opportunity to say that we will send a recap newsletter. It'll probably be in a week or two, so don't look for it this afternoon, but there will be a recap newsletter that comes out with the recording. It'll also have a link to some of those resources that were mentioned. That Utah State document is a really great one. I've used that publication as well. So that link will be in the newsletter too. So if anyone has any questions, we have time for one, maybe two.
Okay, I have a question in the chat now. Had questions recently about canning roasted tomatoes. Is it correct that it's not recommended currently?
So canning roasted tomatoes, that I've never had that question. That's a great question. We always, for our recipes that when we test them in the lab, we look at water activity, we look at pH, and also the liquid to solid ratio that is in the jar. And we look for the coldest spot in that jar. That's the worst case scenario. And then we develop a prescription of how much time you should process that food for. And if it's acid enough, you can process that in a boiling water canner, or if it's not, then you have to use a pressure canner. And then we have a recommendation as well for how many pounds you have to process that for and for how many minutes. And so our recipes currently do not include roasted tomatoes, but it's a great question. And I unfortunately don't have the research available to say that we could use the same recipe, the same time, an acidification method that to ensure a final safe product. And so that's a great question. I never had that one, but I would say that as of now, we do not recommend, since we don't have research to ensure the safety of the product, and we do not want to get anybody sick by changing a detail or changing the acidification process, which is so important. And back in the day, tomatoes were considered acid products, and due to changes in genetics and research that the agronomy side of horticulture people do to improve yield and improve resistance to drought or whatever that might be. An unintended consequence of that was the pH of those tomatoes now is higher than they used to be. So now we have to acidify them to make sure that we have a safe product. So they're borderline now. And with a roasted tomato, I don't know exactly how that process would work. We would have to do some research to test to make sure that wherever we are recommending, we are confident that it's safe and people, if follow the tested recipe, would not get botulism. So great question. Yeah, thank you.
I have a quick question about when we were talking about freezing foods, and that once they're frozen safe, that they stay safe, but the only thing that would be affected would be the quality. Can we get a little bit more specific about what you mean by quality? Is that just going to be the taste and the texture of the food, or is there something else that might be affected?
Yeah, mostly the taste, the texture of that food. And depending on the container you're using, you can experience freeze burn, depending on how long you leave that. Even if you use a good container, like the question of the 2-year turkey, in your freezer, you can use the best container, but it is just the longest that you leave that food in there, it is going to experience some changes in texture and flavor, and freeze burn is the main one that we see. And there's nothing wrong with that food safety wise. You can still cook that food appropriately and eat it, but some people don't like to see that brown weird color that is, and they prefer not to consume it. But that's mainly what what will affect the quality and the texture and color of that product.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, well, I have 12:30. Again, thank you, Dr. Schwan, for joining us today, and thank you to everyone who participated. Don't forget, we do have one more webinar for our summer series, and that one will be curing meats. So hopefully you will join us for that one as well. So thank you all, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. It was nice to see you. Have a great day.
Thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you.